As if things weren't already bad enough, they were very soon to get a whole lot worse. Not long after this, we began to hear about a list, which later became known as July 9th letter. In this list, we were told that Srila Prabhupada had named 11 men who would become his successor acharyas. It must have been sometime in December that I began to hear that included among those 11 were none other than the very same Rameshwar, Satsvarup, and Tamal Krishna. No, that made no sense at all. I knew with every fiber in my being that this was just totally wrong. There was no way that Srila Prabhupada could have appointed those very same men to become the next acharyas in our line. I was already struggling with what they had done. I had absolutely no doubt that had this taken place earlier when Srila Prabhupada's health was not so bad, and that a number of GBC men had met for the deliberate purpose of planning out how to prevent one of his requests from being fulfilled, and those men actually lied on such a large ISKCON worldwide scale to all of his disciples in the temples all over the world, using his name for the sole purpose of not allowing his request to be carried out, I had absolutely no doubt in my heart that Srila Prabhupada would have removed those men from their duties as GBC. No organization can function with leaders like that. Their lying to us undercut all respect for the office of the GBC, all trust in them. It tarnished the ISKCON name. No organization can function like that. For these reasons, I knew for certain that Srila Prabhupada would have dealt very heavily with them. In my heart, I was already thinking like that, knowing they were no longer fit or qualified to occupy the post of GBC, and that Prabhupada would have relieved them of that position for what they had done. But now we're told that instead, Srila Prabhupada had actually selected those very same men to become the next acharyas on our disciplic line. This made absolutely no sense whatsoever to me. These men had just offended and they had just hurt Srila Prabhupada personally. How can I accept that Prabhupada chose them to be the next gurus, to be worshipped the same as Srila Prabhupada? They were now supposed to be worshipped on the same level as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Lord Krishna. No, that is just all wrong. It was totally wrong. So many of my Godbrothers didn't know what these men had just done, or they just didn't understand how serious it was. From their point of view, they had accepted it as a fact that Srila Prabhupada had selected these men to become the next gurus. And so they took anyone who tried to say anything negative about them at all. They saw that person was the one who was wrong and fallen and envious. They saw those who spoke out against this as being the ones who were refusing to accept and follow what Srila Prabhupada had wanted. Those who spoke out, they were the fallen and envious devotees. And so no one would even hear what we had to say. And they refused to believe what we had told them. But I knew what these men had done. I knew that Srila Prabhupada could not have selected those men. I just knew he couldn't have done that. A few other devotees began to openly speak out, telling newer devotees not to accept these men, that none of them were qualified. Very swiftly, they were kicked out of the temple, kicked out of ISKCON. They were labeled as fallen for not accepting Prabhupada and envious offenders of the new gurus. This made it worse for me because I wanted to be an honest and truthful person. I wanted to speak the honest truth. And the honest truth that I knew was that these men had just committed a major offense and were not all qualified or fit to become the next acharyas. But I felt oppressed. I wasn't able to speak up. If I did, then I would no longer be allowed to live in the association of devotees, no longer able to continue to engage in my services to Lord Gauranga and Srila Prabhupada. I did consider it, though. I did consider just going around telling everyone that Rameshwar, Tamal, Satsarup, and the others were all liars and they had offended and hurt Srila Prabhupada. That thought crossed my mind because I wanted to be honest and truthful. But I knew if I did, I would be kicked out of the temple. The only reason I didn't was because I knew I could no longer live without the association of devotees. I would have nothing left to live for. My life would come to an end. And inside, I just felt that Srila Prabhupada wanted me to stay. He wanted me to continue doing my service. But how? How could I just go on as if there was nothing wrong? And how was I to go and not being able to say anything, not to be able to speak the truth, the honest truth? That's what really, one of the things that really bothered me. And none of this was making sense. Nothing was making sense anymore. At that time, I could only think that there were just two possible scenarios. It's the only thing I could think of. And one was that Srila Prabhupada didn't know that these men were not qualified. That he just didn't know that they were capable of disobeying him and capable of taking such offensive actions against him. Srila Prabhupada just didn't know. And so he made a very huge blunder and mistakenly had chosen men who were not at all qualified. The only other scenario that I could think of at that time was that the whole GBC had turned against Srila Prabhupada and were just lying to all of us. That they knew that Srila Prabhupada had never selected these men, but they just lied to us and told us that he had. But neither of those scenarios were acceptable to me. Yet at the time, those are the only two I could think of. I just couldn't think of any other possibility. I knew Rameshwar well enough to know that he had his quirks. At times he exhibited non-Vaishnava behavior. Although it was several years earlier, I also had become aware of Tamal's aggressive desire to want to take over ISKCON. To know more about this, I've made an ancillary note, Tamal's plan to take over ISKCON. You can watch that separately if you'd like. Besides, it was obvious to many of us that these devotees lacked the qualifications at the time. I wasn't aware of it at the time. But on April 22nd, 1977, Tamal was speaking with Srila Prabhupada, and Tamal told Srila Prabhupada that he knew that he, Tamal, was not qualified to be guru. And he told Srila Prabhupada that he had assessed all of Srila Prabhupada's disciples and that none of us were. He told this directly to Srila Prabhupada. And Srila Prabhupada agreed with that assessment. In the chronological timeline section, I actually start out the chronological timeline section with that recording. That was Tamal's own assessment of himself and all of Srila Prabhupada's disciples, and Srila Prabhupada didn't protest and reject that assessment. He didn't tell Tamal that he was wrong. He didn't say, oh, you're just being envious, Tamal. No, he agreed with that assessment. And this took place just 1 month before the May 28th meeting and less than 2.5 months before the July 9th letter was written. Our assessment of these men, our assessment that these men weren't fit or qualified had nothing to do with us being envious, any more than Tamal's assessment or Prabhupada's agreeing with his assessment was made out of enviousness. It was based on knowledge and realization. Of course, I didn't know about that conversation at the time in 1978, but I did know that these men were just not qualified. And I couldn't accept the scenario that Srila Prabhupada had actually selected these men. I couldn't accept that Srila Prabhupada had made such a huge blunder and that he had lacked the knowledge and ability to perceive that these men were not yet qualified. Yet an insignificant and rank-and-file devotee like I could perceive that they were not yet qualified. How am I supposed to accept that Srila Prabhupada wasn't able to do that? So no, I simply couldn't accept that Prabhupada had selected those men to become guru. Yet that's what the GBC is telling us. Because I knew that I knew what these men had just done. And therefore, for me to accept what the GBC was telling us, then if I accepted what the GBC was telling us, then it would force me to accept that Prabhupada had made a huge blunder and accepted men who were not qualified. I just couldn't accept that. I couldn't accept that Srila Prabhupada had made such a blunder. But the only other scenario I could think of at the time was that the whole GBC had turned against Prabhupada and were lying to us. Even though that would seem to be the most obvious case due to the fact that I had just found out that these same men had just lied to us over Srila Prabhupada's personal request, it would seem easy to just accept that this was just another of their lies. But really, to me, that also didn't make sense. Despite Rameshwar's foolishness and thinking that he had to prevent Srila Prabhupada's request from being known and fulfilled, I also knew that he was a very sincere devotee. And in all other ways, he was sold out to serving Srila Prabhupada. All of these men were sold out to serving Srila Prabhupada, despite their sometimes bad decisions and actions. I just couldn't accept that all 24 members of the GBC could have knowingly turned against Srila Prabhupada and told us that just 11 of them were to become gurus, when they knew Srila Prabhupada never said that. As I kept saying, though, and want to emphasize that at that time, the problem for me was those were the only two scenarios I could think of. And neither one made any sense or was acceptable at all. I was stuck. I couldn't accept what the GBC was telling us because I couldn't accept Prabhupada made such a blunder. But then, where did this leave me? Nowhere. And that's how I felt. I felt lost. All I could see was a black future, and there was no answers for what I should do. I had always been a logically driven person. Even at the time, I was designing digital control logic, circuitry, TTL, transistor to transistor logic with OR gates, NOR gates, AND/OR gates, and JK flip-flops and all that. So, it was working with logic, but it was digital logic. But I've always been a logically driven person. And so I always dealt with things in a logical and deductive manner. But with this, due to the limited data and information we were given, nothing made any sense at all. All I knew was that what the GBC was telling us was totally wrong. But my brain was fried out, trying to figure out what was right, to the point that I wasn't able to function anymore. My life basically had just come to a stop. During this time, we didn't have any access to any evidences or information to determine anything on our own. The GBC never gave any explicit quote or quotes from Srila Prabhupada where he clearly and without doubt ordered these men to become actual gurus. They never presented any such evidence because there were no such quotes by Srila Prabhupada. The only evidence we were given is what the GBC told us. And we were supposed to accept that without questioning them and without any supporting evidence. As I said, my mind literally fried. It was frying out because I was trying to make sense of everything. But the only two scenarios I can think of, both of them were unacceptable. So my life basically came to a standstill, trying to figure out what I should do and how to deal with this. I absolutely refused to accept that Srila Prabhupada had made such a horrendous blunder. But that meant I also had to reject what the GBC was telling us. And that meant, I had to reject the GBC as an authority. I didn't want to do that. And I didn't want to leave ISKCON. So I found myself caught between a very dark rock and a totally black, hard place. I was stuck and my life just couldn't go on any longer. Something had to give.